probably one of the biggest benefits is it gets you into a modern system. Like a lot of these DVRs are now 5, 10, maybe
Mm.
even 15 years old, and they don't really have secure remote access. The app is terrible, all that kind of stuff. The Corporal.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the In the Trenches Roundtable. Today's episode is going to be a product and solution focused episode. So we're going to introduce a problem. We're going to talk about some products we carry or that you could find in the industry to solve that problem, and then what solutions we might recommend to help. And so if you have analog cameras and you're not sure what to do, this video is for you. Make sure to stay tuned to the end. We'll hopefully enlighten you with some awesome information. I've got my awesome expert on the line, James. What's up, James?
Hey, how's it going? Let's figure out what we can do here.
Let's figure it out. Let's figure it out. So that's the scenario. I've got an old analog system. I know some cameras work, some certainly don't. I want to upgrade. What options do I have?
Rip and replace it, get rid of it, right? That's solution number one. Like,
That's
if
definitely.
you can, and I'm going to preface this to say that the vast majority of clients we reach when they are in this scenario can't do this. But rip and replace, what that means is you take out those cameras, you probably throw them in the trash at this point. You grab your cabling, you throw that, maybe get a couple pennies for the copper or whatever, and then you put in all new IP cameras, you put in new IP lines, Ethernet lines, and you get a new NVR, and you got a clean break right into the world of modern IP, and you're not really making any sacrifices, or you don't have to really think too much of the considerations. But one of the big considerations with this is how feasible it actually is that for most people.
Right. I mean, and that's the number one thing that we would see on the consulting side is absolutely this is a common scenario, very common scenario. We do see it all the time, like James just said, and especially some of the clientele we're dealing with in this scenario, maybe don't know where to start because it's been so long since they've had a solution like really put in place. Um, that's something to consider is really like the just upfront cost of removing all that old cabling, removing those old components and putting in all new stuff. I would say at least for a majority of our clients, that initial upfront cost is sometimes too large, right? So I think it's really like first looking for looking at like in detail what the options are, it's kind of understanding where maybe you are in your scenario, what you're willing to spend or not spend to try to get a, solution up and running, right?
Exactly. And I think the viability of this solution is dependent on how many cameras you have to some degree too. If
Mm,
you have four cameras and you're looking to expand to eight, or you have two cameras, like if you have a small amount of analog, rip and replace is a lot more viable, right? You can do it
hmm
a lot more easily because
It's a really good point.
cost of it. The
Hmm
other reality of this thing too is sometimes it's not even just a costing. Obviously, it costs a lot of money to rip out those cables, run brand new cables, get new cameras, everything. You're basically starting from scratch, and you have to pay to demolish basically in this case. But the other problem with rip and replace is that you may be in a position where that's just not even feasible from like the building standpoint or the operation
hmm
standpoint, where having people go and rip out cable is going to interrupt your facility. If you're a very busy manufacturing plant and you're only offline for 6 hours a day, that's not really feasible. To go in front of equipment and pull these cables and all that kind of stuff. If you're a food, a very busy restaurant that's open 7 days a week and you've got analog cameras and you really want to jump into higher end stuff, very difficult to stop your restaurant to go and do this, right? So that's the other consideration is like the size and the scope of the rip and replace, and then also what kind of considerations in terms of do you actually have the time in the day to do this? And sometimes that is even beyond the cost side of house. So
Yeah, like the disruption to the organization. That's such a good point. Another thing too, yeah, like the feasibility of it as a whole, right? Like, so glad you mentioned, you know, can you even like access the cable again, right? Like, is the cable in plaster walls because it was, part of like the building of the building or something, right? We see it all the time on like self-storage facilities where they've got an old system, there was maybe conduit underground in between buildings, right? And now because of the 10 years of cars and trucks and things driving on it, that conduit's crushed and you're not pulling that cable out even if you wanted to,
No,
right?
yeah, great point.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a really, really good point. Okay, so you can rip and replace. And rip and replacing, again, quick synopsis is literally taking all of the components, cameras, recording device, cabling, putting all new stuff in. One of the best pros is because, I mean, what? You get to enter the world of IP with a fresh new set of eyes, right? It's totally going to be a night and day difference, by the way.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's the big thing. I think one of the questions somebody might even have, how do I even know if I have analog? Well, here's a picture of the connector for one. And then
Hmm.
number two, if you can't see more than 20 feet in front of you and everything's kind of grainy and you're like, man, this thing's look terrible, you probably have analog
I
too.
mean,
But yeah, I mean, when you do a rip and replace, you get to start completely from scratch. You get a brand new, you don't really have to, you're not hobbled by any of the potential legacy stuff you have. So it's the best solution in terms of like if it works for you. But obviously the biggest cons of all this is the price and the disruption factor are potentially either maybe both one or two, one or the other are going to be too much, or even both in a lot of cases. So we sometimes that they're doing a full demolition of the or renovation of the building or something like that, and we end up doing a rip and replace, and so that's a solution in some cases, but I wouldn't say it's the most common solution.
definitely not the most common solution. What would you say is the most common solution, James?
I'd say the next solution we can talk about is the hybrid NVRs, and so
Mm,
hybrid NVRs, hybrid DVRs, however you want to call them. Um, these are recording devices that often, like for example, our Corporal line, we have an 8 channel, a 16 channel, and likely a 32 channel in the next 6 months or so. And what that allows you to do is retain your current analog cameras. So you just plug your analog cameras back into this new NVR. Um, and it gives you the ability to also add IP cameras. And probably one of the biggest benefits is it gets you into a modern system. Like a lot of these DVRs are now 5, 10, maybe
mm.
even 15 years old, and they don't really have secure remote access. The app is terrible, all that kind of stuff. The Corporal is in the same line as our NVR, so you still use our great SCW Go mobile app. It works with ViewStation, so you get this modern upgrade to the user experience along with retaining all of your current infrastructure. You don't have to rip and replace, and then on top of that, you can add cameras. So
Right.
the whole
Yeah,
lot
and
probably hit those one by one, but
yeah, no doubt. I was gonna say, and I think that's, you know, at least for me and what I've experienced, the biggest key is for those folks who maybe identify quickly that, okay, ripping and replacing the entire infrastructure of the system isn't possible, we're really left with only a few options. And this is predominantly the most common option because it's so cost effective. You simply take that recording device that you have in place now, put our corporal line in place. The connections are the same. And you just screw them back in the same way. And if it's the right type of analog camera, it works, right? Like it's pretty that cut and dry, right?
yeah, that's simple. It's plug and play, like in the most literal sense. So
Right.
um, that's a good point too. I mean, one of the things that specifically about a Corporal and a lot of other hybrids out there, we want to be unbiased as we can, and but the nice thing about those too is that they work with a ton of different analog standards. So there's not just
Hmm.
traditional analog, there's also analog HD that sort of came out maybe after the fact. And we actually have an analog HD camera that you can do. So not only can you upgrade that user experience, upgrade the DVR, everything, but if you want an easy way of upgrading the image quality now, you get what we call the Diplomat. This is a 5 megapixel analog HD, and you're going to go from seeing a very blurry looking image to with and not just like the resolution isn't just better on these cameras, like everything about them, like the sensors higher quality, so you're going to have better light performance and better colors and all that kind of stuff, and you're going to go from a really old looking, probably not very effective camera to one that's very effective without having without even having to replace your cable, which is huge too. So
Right. So back to the scenario, right? If we're in that scenario where we have some of the cameras working, some of them not, right? We can easily get those cameras that are working. You can salvage them, run them for the life of the camera. And then the ones that aren't working, you don't have to replace the cable. You can keep the cable in place and add one of these diplomatic cameras, right?
yep, exactly, yeah. So you got kind of the best of both worlds. It allows you to expand. And then another point of the Corporals is that they're called hybrid for a reason. They actually can accept IP cameras as well. So one of the things you can do is have IP cameras on a switch and then add them to the Corporal as well. So that way, if you're expanding, you don't necessarily want to go and rip and replace those things, but you're adding new cameras anyway. You don't want to be running analog cable at that point. You don't want to run coax cable. So you can run new IP lines, add them through the switch, and then have our whole line of IP cameras accessible to you as well. And that's like a huge benefit. That's where the hybrid side comes in. So not only can it take the analog, but we've got IP options here too for you that allow you to modernize part of your facility for sure.
Absolutely. Right. And I think that's like a real quick keynote that we definitely want to like hit on is that by no means is SCW ever saying you should newly install a DVR, a hybrid NVR DVR, or a new diplomat camera, right? If it's a net new run, like it doesn't exist already, you should definitely be running IP cables. You should definitely be using IP cameras. And a hybrid NVR allows you to salvage the existing stuff you might have, like the existing cabling and cameras, while also allowing you to expand, add new cameras with that IP line. Exactly.
Yep.
Mhm.
Yeah, this is a really good solution and it's really cost effective. And I think that's why it's the most popular one probably. And it's pretty simple too, right? You're just replacing your DVR gets you the modern experience. It gives you the ability to upgrade your current cameras to or fix broken ones with a new analog HD standard camera, and even expand to IP stuff as you need to as well. So
Right, right. One last thing I just want to touch on this solution, this hybrid NVR solution is, we see a lot of multi-location clients and they might have some facilities that are a little bit more modern than others, right? So some of their facilities might be running on our IP-based Admiral and Imperial line of equipment, and they're using ViewStation and they're managing multiple locations that way. And then they have these, maybe they're acquiring new sites or they have these outdated facilities that have analog stuff.
yeah,
Well, you don't have to leave those, out in the dark anymore, right? We can simply replace that head-end unit and get them pulled into the same platform. So,
yeah, excellent point. Yeah, that allows you to standardize your rollouts. So now you
absolutely.
know that every single one you can access through ViewStation versus like, oh, that one has that old DVR. We're gonna have to go there and we see this a lot with like people who are taking over franchises and everything where they literally still have to go to some of these locations with a USB thumbstick and pull out footage as they need because that's an old one that they didn't realize they could actually upgrade it for couple $100 and get a new modern system out of it and be able to work with modern software like ViewStation. So really great point. Yeah, I
Exactly.
think you want to wrap up this section and talk about kind of the more complicated one now after.
Yeah, definitely. I was just going to say, I think that does it really, right? For the solution two, which is using one of the corporal MVRs or DVRs, one of the hybrid ones. And then so yes, we have the rip and replace option. We've got kind of salvaging what you might have while adding new IP stuff if you need it. And then the third option. Let's pivot over here to the third option. And we refer to this as encoders.
Yeah.
Walk me through what this means.
So, one of the things about a hybrid DVR is that they're not quite a full NVR. And what I mean by that is they're, for example, maybe not the greatest at dealing with a bunch of 4K IP cameras. So if you really plan to gradually rip and replace, in a way, all of your cameras and eventually go with all 4K IP cameras, the Corporals can't really do the 4K IP stuff as well as, our Admiral series, our NVRs, etc. And so what an encoder is a device that grabs your analog. It sort of is like a DVR because it has the the BNC things on the back of it. So it looks in a way like a small DVR, but instead of actually recording, what it does is it turns your analog stuff into an IP camera in some ways. So what it does is it makes it network accessible. So then you can add it to an NVR, and then you can get like a full-fledged NVR. So does that kind of answer that question?
Yeah, I think it answers that question, right? So why would I want to look at this solution? If we play back the scenario, right, and we say I've got an analog system today, some of the cameras are working, some aren't. I kind of do want to add some coverage. Why might I use this encoder solution? Why wouldn't I just use the hybrid one?
Mostly because let's just say in this scenario, you've got a couple of cameras that you maybe want to retain, but they might be difficult to get to, or they might have been actually pretty decent analog cameras, a good zoom, like a specialty long range license plate one or something like that. Maybe you don't want to upgrade that one because that's going to get very expensive. This allows you to um, get a new NVR because the NVR is going to be better at IP cameras. It's got plug and play switching. It's got a lot of advantages over necessarily using a hybrid NVR when it comes to being a pure NVR IP solution, right? And so, yeah, this allows you to still retain some of the analog, investment that you have. You don't have to go and rip and replace it, but you're going to be interfacing everything through an NVR. So as you expand to other parts of your facility and you're adding IP cameras, you don't necessarily have to worry about what resolution do I want them at. You can get whatever resolution you want with us because it's just going to work because you have the Admiral series, right? In that case, in our case. So what you're getting out of the encoder solution, I guess, to put a real nutshell on it, is you're getting kind of the best of both worlds. You're retaining some of your analog, investment while also allowing yourself to fully jump into the IP world. So you're not quite ripping replacing, but you're not having to make any kind of sacrifices when it comes to the IP that you plan to add. Really, really big for, if you're expanding your facility. Maybe you bought your neighbor's thing over there and now you have double the space and you need coverage over there. You're going to want to put new IP stuff over there, but you don't necessarily want to rip and replace your current stuff. So,
Exactly. I'd say it's spot on, right? Some use cases, expanding facilities, people who might be growing or expanding their facility. You could think of like a manufacturing that is maybe adding like warehousing space or, something of that like. So you could think of a church as like building a new mess hall or something, right? Things like this. I would also say to those multi-location clients who are maybe acquiring sites and they want to future-proof the infrastructure without totally ripping and replacing. This would be a perfect option for them to be able to, like James said, get the best of both worlds at the most cost-effective price point, right?
yep.
Um, yeah, we've seen it happen, quite a bit. And, as they slowly graduate the analog cameras that are connected to those encoders, they can just remove those encoders from the equation once they have all IP cameras.
Yeah. And you mentioned the encoder is like a piece of hardware that, it does this job. So again, I mentioned it looks a little bit like a DVR. And these come from various manufacturers with different capabilities, etc. But one of the coolest things, going a little bit back to solution number two, which is our Corporal or hybrids, in our case, our Corporals, the Corporal hybrid can actually act as an encoder in some capacity. So one of the issues with encoders is they tend to be very expensive. Like $1,000 for four cameras. So then you're paying essentially $250 for per camera to retain your analog, which is like, isn't that kind
Mhm.
of defeating the purpose at that point? Whereas like our Corporal 16 channel, I think is like $350 or something like that. And so now you're looking at, well, let's do the math a little bit. 350 divided by 16, it's like 21 bucks, 22 bucks to retain that analog. And so what you typically do is you have your Admiral NVR, and then you tell the Admiral NVR to connect to the Corporal's IP address, and you pick what channel you want to import, and then it adds that analog, just like, it's almost like a hybrid in itself, but it's grabbing that analog camera from the Corporal sending it over via an IP to the Admiral, and then you're able to connect to it. So it allows you to add everything you want to that Admiral in terms of new IP, while the Corporal actually doesn't even need a hard drive in this scenario because it's just simply grabbing that signal, transmitting it to IP, and sending it to the Admiral NVR, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it definitely makes sense. And actually it does bring up a question about that kind of a setup. If I was following you correctly, it sounds like in this encoder setup, at least in some capacity, it's reliant on the network.
Hmm. Yeah, that's right. So all those analog cameras are basically going to be sent from the Corporal through your network to or through some network, I should say. You can still do like a dual network NVR and kind of keep them behind that if you wanted to. But yeah, you're going to have that situation where they're almost acting like a big IP camera. It's acting like an IP camera that has 16 streams on it in the case of a
Mm,
16 channel Corporal. That's another way of looking at it.
that makes sense. And I would say that's probably like that would probably be one really the only catch, right?
Yeah. The other catch too, at least in terms of the corporal acting as an encoder, is that doesn't send over any motion data or anything like that. So
Mm.
the downside of that is, of course, that you have to record 24/7 with these analog cameras. Now, one thing you can do instead of like acting as a pure encoder, and you could actually still have the corporal, still get an admiral or an imperial NVR, fully fledged NVR, use them through view station, and still primarily view everything through your admiral. And the event you have like a needle and haystack kind of thing, or you need to check motion or whatever, go back to the make sure you put a hard drive in the corporal and check that. But
Mm.
that is the number one downside. It's basically sending only the pure video stream. There's no like interpretation of the way IP cameras work, not to get too into it, but the IP camera is actually responsible for giving that motion. So the data for the motion is not being sent by the in the encoder situation. So you have to record 24/7. That's the other major caveat.
Gotcha. So really, if we're trying to like break it down simply, cons of this encoder setup may only be able to record in 24/7, it sounds like, and relying at least somewhat or entirely on the LAN to communicate the data.
That's a good reason to put a hard drive in too, potentially. If your network
Mhm.
maybe is not the most stable network in the world. If the problem with that is if your network just disconnects and the Corporal can't send the video over to the NVR, the Admiral in this case, then you're not going to record during that time period for those analog cameras. So putting a hard drive in there means
Mhm.
that worst case, hey, we had an outage on our network from Tuesday at 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. I need footage. You can go to that Corporal directly. You can connect it through view station, etc., whatever you need to do, and then get that footage that you need instead of being completely out of luck from it.
That makes sense. Makes sense. Um, so I think, that kind of wraps up, right? That third option. Now, I want to wrap this entire episode up by asking you this, James. If you were this person, what option would you choose?
For me, again, I'd have to know maybe how many cameras I have and everything like that, but I'd probably go with the encoder option because I like the ability to feel like I'm getting true IP solution. So if I want maybe a bunch of 4K cameras for my new part of my facility, I would go with that. Or I'd probably go with the hybrid. Either one of these, they all have their pros and cons, but I'd have to know each
Mhm.
scenario specifically. But I really like the encoder solution because it's a creative way of being able to sort of get the best of both worlds with just a couple of caveats. So yeah, I might go that. I might look at that one first, I would say.
Definitely. I would totally agree. I think for me, it would be, entirely dependent on what my budget was like,
Yeah.
right? Frankly. And then ultimately, yeah, I would really try to be thinking about as much future proofing as I can. So for me, I think it would either be the rip and replace or the encoder solution. Yeah. That's
Yeah.
that's probably what I'd go with.
And I think that's where we come in too. SCW's here to not just like tell you the solutions. Yeah, we just told you about three different solutions, and you may be capable of picking one of those and be like, yep, this one works for me. But if you're not sure, what can they do? They can reach out to us, and what happens?
Absolutely. And our team of consultants will help walk you through and advise and guide you through the best decision for what you're experiencing right now.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yep. Yeah,
Absolutely.
that's part of the consultation process with us, which is completely complimentary. So if you're in this situation, you have old analog cameras, and you're really not sure which path you should go by, or how you should do it, give us a call. We'll walk you through it and deal with your budget, deal with your issues at your facility in terms of like what you can and what you can't do. So um yeah, I guess my little spiel on it.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. That'll put a button in it. So three very realistic, very viable options for you to salvage or completely replace your analog equipment and step into the IP world. So if you do have any questions, if you find yourself in this scenario, if you know somebody in this scenario, send them this video, send them our info. We'd be happy to chat. Again, a simple conversation is free. Check out the links to a lot of the resources in the description below. If you have any feedback or thoughts on what we should cover next, what type of problem, leave it in the comments. Let us know. Feel free to reach us at any of our contact information. We'll be happy to help. Thanks so much for tuning in again. We'll see you next time.
See ya.